documents of all of these the easiest to read and understand, and I compliment you on that. I also thought that they, for the first time, offered some opinions that found a great deal of consensus with commission members. So I think that's largely why you're here, is for us to follow up on some of that. Do you have any short opening remarks?
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate. Just by way of introduction, you've seen my CV, and it was outlined in my original report, but just as a reminder, I'm a criminalist by experience. I spent up to now over 41 years in forensic laboratories or independent forensic practice. My original degree was in physics, and so when I did get involved in fire investigation and fire science, the processes involved, of course, fell readily within my pre-existing educational preparation. I got involved originally analyzing fire debris for the county crime lab, and the puzzle started shortly thereafter when I got unusual, or what I considered interesting, laboratory results, and I turned to the expert, the scene investigator. I said, well, where did this come from? Why do I see this? And he didn't know. Well, as a scientist, if somebody says, I don't know, the usual reaction is, well, let's find out. And I was lucky enough in 1974, when I went to work for the state of California, that my position was actually partially funded by the then state fire marshal. And one of my duties was helping present live burn training exercises for state and local investigators. And my first day for Department of Justice was spent making Molotov cocktails and observing them being thrown. People have made the comment since that I claim that I've observed or caused to have started something on the order of 500 or 600 structure fires. People point out that I must have had a very interesting childhood. I point out, in contrast, that while I grew up in Chicago, I did not grow up in the neighborhood where the fire started. I was a physics experimenter. I never set fire to anything until, well, intentionally, until the state of California asked me to. But that was an unusual turning point, I guess, in that I got a chance to see real fires in real structures set by a variety of techniques, and observe them, photograph them, videograph them. And it was apparent after the first few years that much of what I was seeing and my fellow investigators were seeing in these fires wasn't what the books were saying. The books, as several people have pointed out, that were the basis of investigator training in the 80s, was very limited. And virtually all of them were written by scene investigators from the insurance or police or firefighting backgrounds. The only one
of the points that we noticed when you were talking about that in your written materials was you seemed to have a really good grasp, and it gave us a very good summary of this particular development, which was important to us because we have struggled with the notion of whether or not you can judge someone's work at a time against a standard of practice if a true standard of practice didn't exist. And I'm going to summarize it, but you tell me if it's accurate or not. It seemed to me that you came to the firm conclusion that at the time of the Willingham investigation, there was in fact not a standard of practice that you could measure against people's work.
Not a, excuse me, not a uniform standard of practice. That's correct.
Well, and I notice you add the word uniform, but isn't that sort of the point of a standard of practice, that it is uniform across either a community or a state or a nation?
Well, that's one of the critical issues with fire investigation, is that fire investigations are I've described it flippantly, but somewhat accurately, is when somebody says, well, who does fire investigations? And I said, well, everybody and their dog. And that, unfortunately, is true, because Fire
Say
investigations.
is or was?
Well, it still is, yes.
Still is.
It is and was the situation. Where fire departments are, under most fire codes, are charged with establishing origin and cause of fires. If there is a suspicion that fire was deliberately started, then police authorities are involved. Sometimes that's in the same person as a fire marshal, or police detectives or somebody from another law enforcement agency that has law enforcement powers of evidence seizure and interviews and filing of criminal charges and things like that. In some cases, it's entirely done by fire marshals from start to finish, but fire investigation across the United States is the ugly stepchild. Nobody really wants to do it. The fire departments don't want to be bothered because it's not very exciting, it's time consuming, and they don't often see it as helping in their major responsibility of protecting their community, although if they stopped more of the accidental and intentional fires in their communities, they would be saving money and lives and property. But police don't want to do it because the scene is ugly and messed up, and there's been hoses and people and destruction. It involves kinds of evidence that most police investigators don't want to deal with. The forensic scientists are not often involved, except, at least in my experience, when there's been a fatality. And as a criminalist, that's usually where I got called. We have a fire, yeah, we have a body. Oh, and...
I want to jump back to my question.
Sure.
Which is, was it your conclusion that there was not a standard of practice back at the time of the investigation of the Willingham case for us to measure against?
Well, and I come back to my response that there was not a uniform one. There were within agencies guidelines for how this was supposed to be done. There was a body of knowledge. Faulty.
Let me rephrase it then, because at the time we initiated this investigation, we weren't even using the word standard of practice. We didn't have a definition of negligence. We didn't have a definition of misconduct. We have since adopted one that focuses upon the standard of practice that existed at the time of the investigation. It's part of what we asked Dr. Byler, and I guess the Commission will continue to explore this, but assuming that we're talking about a standard of practice for Texas, in other words, statewide, everyone held to the same standard for how you conduct a fire investigation. Was there a uniform standard of practice in Texas against which we could measure it against for the Willingham case in 1991?
With the, excuse me, with the exceptions of the general investigative principles that Dr. Byler mentioned a few minutes ago, interviews and evaluation of all possible causes of fire, to my knowledge there was not. I did cases in Texas. I was with ATF for 4 years. I conducted investigations, or I assisted in investigations here in Texas, and starting about 1990 I did outside cases here in Texas. So I've worked with Texas authorities on a variety of cases, and just like everywhere else, the practices have evolved over the past 25 years.
Okay, thank you. And that repeats what your conclusions were in your written report to us. Any questions from the commissioners? Thank you very much. I'm waiting for somebody to raise their hand. You're sorry.
Would it be your opinion, would you concur with Dr. Byler, based on your review of the documents, that the cause of the fire, based on standards, and I'm not going to use the term standard of practice because I realize it's an ambiguous term, back in 1991 would be undetermined? Would that be your opinion, your shared opinion?
Yes, I would, especially because, Dr. Byler pointed out, there was no evaluation of, at least reported in any of the documents that I reviewed, that possible accidental electrical causes could have started this fire. Everything that was documented post-fire was just as consistent with an accidental fire starting in that bedroom as an intentional fire. And then you add in the other possibility of child play and things like that as possible sources of ignition, and you have really no basis for concluding that this was arson.
None whatsoever? What about a statement from an individual that they said, he told me that he set the fire? Is that hypothetically something you could rely upon?
Not much. In my 41 years of evaluating physical evidence and witness statements, and especially verbal admissions, I find them very unreliable, especially verbal admissions or somebody saying he said, he did, whatever. Those are the most unreliable kinds of evidence.
And that's your personal opinion?
Well, that's my professional opinion, yes.
Right. That's not a standard of practice that says you cannot rely upon statements of others, is it?
No, it's something I point out when I teach my investigation classes.
And in fact, the 921 expressly permits an investigator to rely upon that kind of information. It cautions them, but it doesn't say they can rely upon it, can it?
Oh, by all means, you need to talk to witnesses.
So if you have two investigators, one of them finds such a statement to be credible, the other one finds the other statement not to be credible, I mean, somebody has to decide, don't they?
That's correct. And then you test it against the available evidence, the other available evidence, particularly physical evidence. And that's the way you test most verbal statements. Confessions are in the same rank.
So one of your concerns is the failure to eliminate alternative explanations for the fire, correct?
Yes, that's a major failing. And I was just looking at the edition of Kirk's, my textbook, that was current in 1992, and there is a statement exactly to that effect, that in order to conclude that a fire was arson, you have to be able to conclusively eliminate accidental and natural causes. And that was not done in this case.
Now, in the case of the indicators that are observations, the patterns, things of that nature, clearly that relates to fire science, the dynamics of a fire, and that evolved over time. A great deal of work has been published in the scientific literature. But in terms of an investigator's obligation to eliminate those other explanations, sources of fire, has that changed from 1991 to the present day, or is that something that uniformly should take place?
No, that has not changed. Our knowledge of the ambiguity of patterns, which were highly depended upon in the 1980s and 90s, that has changed. But our reliance on the basic principle of does my data support one cause for this fire is still predominant.
What should they have done to rule out an electrical source of the fire? Say at that time, what should they have done?
They should have evaluated the scene as it was found and looked at each potential fuel package in the room, each bed, look for ignition mechanisms around each bed, look for evidence of electrical failures not in the fixed wiring. That's a very rarely a cause of fires in modern structures. It's much more likely to be what's plugged into those receptacles. And based on the information I saw, there was no evaluation. The contents of the room were just shoveled out. And things like electrical ceiling fixtures, lights failing, for instance, or in one case I can remember a bed caught fire, and usual suspicion is if all that's burned is the bed, somebody got in there and set the bed on fire. Well, it was an 87-year-old woman who didn't really have much in the way of personal complications that would cause that kind of, or bring about that kind of fire. And the investigator happened to look up and realize there was a light fixture above, and when he sifted through the bed, he found the remains of a heavy glass light diffuser. And he asked her about it. She said, oh yeah, my eyesight isn't very good, so I put 2 100-watt light bulbs in that lamp the other day. And, you know, come to think of it, I left it on. And what had happened was that these overwattage lamps had caused the light fixture to shatter, and the hot glass fell into bed and started the bed on fire. Well, without A, talking to the individual, and then B, looking for evidence, that would have gone down as, at best, a undetermined fire, and at worst, an incendiary one.
Did you talk to these investigators?
No, I did not.
Dr. Wilson, would it be your opinion that the investigative community should have been aware of the process of elimination in assessing the fire, cause of fire during that time?
Yes, even during 1991, that was a known principle of fire investigation, is to evaluate the possible causes and eliminate them. And if you can't, it's an undetermined fire.
Was there any documentation required for that process of elimination?
No, that was very weak at the time, and in many cases, it was a single line in a report. I evaluated possible electrical causes, and they were eliminated, period. Well, what does that mean? That's a weakness that's since been addressed.
Are you suggesting that the investigation was flawed and that the investigators were negligent?
Well, I would certainly say it was flawed from the standpoint of not evaluating the scene properly and not evaluating the evidence that was there at the end of the fire, yes.
What about the second part?
Even in 1991, I would be surprised that an investigator, a professional investigator, would not have excavated those scenes, especially with the loss of life.
And therefore you think they were negligent?
I would have to say yes. They did not follow even the principles in my textbook that pre-existed that investigation.
What is the reliable information that you have to know that they didn't do that?
Only the description of the scene and the photographs of piles of debris that hadn't been evaluated.
But you didn't talk to them and agreed that the manner in which the fire investigators documented their work at that time was somewhat limited. So how confident can you be?
Well, it does come down to documentation of evidence found. And especially in a death case, why wouldn't you document what you did?
Well, we can fault him for not documenting, but aren't you using that as a way to jump to the conclusion that he didn't do some other things?
Well, we can only evaluate what the record is at this point.
I understand, but...
I understand the primary investigators passed away,
Yes,
or at least one of them has.
one of them has. But when you're sitting here trying to decide whether or not there was an arson, the absence of information caused you to be cautious and not express an opinion and to say that it's undetermined. Why shouldn't that same principle apply when you're trying to determine whether someone is negligent? In other words, why find them negligent on the lack of information? Why can't you simply acknowledge that we don't have a very complete record here?
Well, if you're gonna go to court and testify in a capital case that this individual was responsible for setting this fire, you really have a professional obligation to include that documentation. And
Nobody disagrees with you about that, but we're talking about what were they expected to do back in the time period that they were doing it. This is an easy case if we're judging it under today's standards.
Yes. Point well taken. I was not present during the original investigation or the trial, and so I don't know what this expectation would have been for 1991.
Well, and I'm not trying to be critical of your work or anything. What I want everybody to keep remembering is we're talking about events that happened over 20 years ago under poor documentation without the expectation that they were going to be reused. And doesn't that somewhat limit our confidence that we can have in the conclusions that we can draw about negligence? It doesn't change what we can conclude about flaws, but doesn't it change how confident we can be about negligence?
Yes, I would yield that point.
But not keeping good records, doesn't that amount to also negligence?
Well, that's why I hesitated in responding to your original question, is that especially in a capital case where one would expect extensive review somewhere down the judicial process, I would expect full documentation.
You expect that now. Was it the standard then?
Well, it was certainly my practice then.
And that's why you're at the top of your field. But was that the standard of practice in Texas at that time?
That I can't say.
Would you say that since we don't have any scientific evidence that this was an arson, would you say that the sole basis on which we can call this an arson is on eyewitness account and confessions only? In this particular case, so I'm talking about Willingham case, that's the only basis on which we can conclude, right? This is an arson.
That's correct. There was no reliable scientific evidence of the presence of an accelerant inside the structure, and there were no incontrovertible physical indicators. So yes, you had eyewitnesses and you had admissions.
So the confession of the snitch in the prison and the eyewitness at the scene, these are the bases on which this is an arson?
That sounds like what you're left with, yeah. The issue about the detection of material at the threshold was one point I was going to raise in terms of the progress that was certainly being made in the 1980s in laboratory identifications. Is in that in the early 1980s the detection limit was pretty high, and there were frequently instances where I set controlled fires with flammable liquids, and they were not, and I observed the fire, I observed the collection, and they were not detectable by my methods after the fire. The survival, of course, of those materials is entirely driven by how much was used, what the surface was, the duration and intensity of the fire, and the time and conditions under which the evidence was later recovered. As our laboratory methods improved, the detection limits got lower and lower. And one thing that we realized was there was a lot of background ignitable liquids in everyday environment. And I remember one case where I analyzed debris from a fire in a commercial structure, and there were a number of samples that had a medium petroleum distillate in it. And I called the investigator up and I said, yeah, there was stuff there. And he said, would it make any difference if I told you that those baseboards were from a commercial bakery and that they went through every week and used a spray-on insecticide at the bases of the walls? And I said, you better give me a sample of the insecticide. Sure enough, that's what that residue was. But he was a good enough investigator to say, what if? In this case, they were satisfied that what was the only positive was at the threshold of the door, not inside the building, but at the threshold of the door. Therefore, there was ignitable liquids. And ignitable liquids, I think the original testimony was in large quantities. Well, if you use a large quantity and the building's still standing, it isn't completely gutted, chances are pretty good that you'd find that, even by the laboratory methods of 1991-92. And so that's why I consider the ignitable liquid finding at the threshold irrelevant to this case.
Thank you. I'd like to make a comment if I could. One of the investigators stated that he had had numerous training experiences at Texas A&M University. And we have the manual now, and we've gone back to the manual, and there's several references to flashover in structural areas. And in the manual, it says that flashover and the fire investigation may cause the area to appear to have been exposed to flammable accelerants. And the investigator admitted in his testimony that the pattern could have been produced by some other means. I mean, we've already heard that before. Plus, there were two other possibilities that there may have been an intruder or it may have been a child. Do you find this have any relevance to this standard of care as what was taught in between 1988 and 1991?
Well, certainly.
This was taught several times.
Sure.
Throughout the state.
And certainly the word could be produced, or that concept is an important one. Can I produce a flashover fire with ignitable liquids that causes no burns? Yes. Can I produce a flashover fire without flammable liquids that produces floor level burns? Yes, I can. And the issue is, when I see floor level burns, I need to think as an investigator, what are my possibilities? Did I have an ignitable liquid? Did I have fall down? Because that's the most common cause in less intense fires is stuff falling from the walls or falling from the ceiling and causing localized burns, and then that material with the first hose string gets washed out the back door. It's certainly important for investigators to realize that intense radiant heat from the hot gas layer can cause floor level burns, even in the absence of complete flashover. And so that kind of training was important, as long as you realize the but inherent in that. But there are other causes for floor level burns. And yes, there were a lot of investigators that their motto was, clean the room out and we'll look at the floor patterns. Well, the floor patterns are, in my experience, the least informative patterns in a room. But that took a long time to reverse. And certainly my first publication talking about radiant heat didn't mention the word flashover. That was 1987. When I said, watching these rooms burn, when that hot smoke layer gets to a certain temperature, the floor starts to catch fire. And in the open areas. So it starts to look like a trail of liquid trailed around the open areas. And that was published once in 1987. My own textbooks didn't mention it, and I don't think mentioned flashover itself as a term until about 1991, or possibly even later. But yes, we have learned a lot about the but alsos, and that's the important thing, that when you're evaluating evidence, I have evidence that suggests A, but could it have been B or C? And if I can't eliminate B or C, then I have to say, well, I can't tell. That's really the reason we still insist that investigators, or now insist that investigators, if they suspect an ignitable liquid, they take a sample. No matter what the dynamics are or what the canine says, to take a sample and get it done by a proper analytical method. Then if it's positive, then you have something to go with. If it's negative...
The manual says to go ahead and collect samples.
Yes.
In the manual that they were instructed, he was instructed with.
Yes.
Do you think that this might constitute negligence?
Well, you said he was instructed with it. We don't have evidence that he was instructed with that particular manual.
Or as far as we know, this is the only manual that was used by the Texas Engineering Experiment Station from 1988 to 1992. He took numerous courses.
I don't doubt that he took the courses, but you don't have any direct evidence that he had that manual.
I don't.
We can finish the question, we can figure out what kind of way.
I'm sorry, was I? Oh.
Would that constitute negligence if you knew about accelerant, lack of that flashover could cause a pattern that would be accidental, or it could be caused by accelerant? It could go either way. And ignoring that possibility, would that constitute negligence?
At that time.
I can't say, because I've taught an awful lot of courses, and we've covered this, and they come back, you know, a year later, and it's all novel. It was like you never talked about it at all, and that's the frustration with 921 as well as my own stuff and my lectures. Is you put it out there, and you hope for the best, and there are some people that will continue to ignore it. And no amount of certification and things like that seems to catch that.
I have one more question, if you don't mind. You have stated that there was no uniform standards of practice for state or local fires in Texas or elsewhere in USA. And in 1991.
To my knowledge, that's correct.
And at some later point, after 921 was well established and accepted as a standard, 1995, 1998, whenever, would the state fire marshal's office have a duty to correct? And should they have a duty to correct, and were they negligent in not carrying the responsibility out?
For cases already done, or
Yes,
for
already
maintaining
done.
training standards?
In which they testified in the criminal trial.
That I can't say.
Would you as an investigator, as an expert, go back and say that I testified 10 years ago and I was wrong? Would you correct yourself?
I have had a lot of investigators face that very decision after you know, accepting the new knowledge and realizing the shortcomings of their previous cases. I don't know how many of them have successfully gone back and said, you know, I made a mistake. And that's really the inherent reason why so many investigators were reluctant to accept 921 and new scientific knowledge, because they would be forced to admit that to themselves. In an adversarial justice system in which we practice, it's really hard. I've thought about this myself. If I realize I've made a mistake, who do I go to? I go to the prosecutor who handled the original case, and I said, you know, I got doubts about my testimony or my conclusions. And their reaction would normally be, your testimony didn't matter much to that case, so no, I'm not going to revisit it. And that's not very encouraging, but that's certainly an expected response. But you know, if it's a key element, and then you go back to the prosecutor and say, you know, look, this was a serious miscarriage of justice. In my instances, I've managed to catch those before they actually go to trial. Not in the cases that I've done, but cases that I've reviewed to say, gee, this doesn't really meet the appropriate standards, and we've been able to kind of intercept the prosecution before it actually goes to trial. In many respects, it's the obligation of the opposition counsel. I mean, this is an adversarial system. You should be able to say, I don't believe this person, and I think he's wrong, and I'm going to call an expert and find somebody who will counter him.
I know perhaps there is no law requiring you to do that, but as a scientist, isn't it your ethical duty to correct yourself if you later find a mistake was made? And to inform the agency that I made an error in my testimony or in my conclusions. Would you consider
I have done that, yes.
So from that perspective, would you say that the State Fire Marshal's Office had not done that and that is negligent?
I don't know what the awareness was of that investigator and whether he later on realized that there was an error.